The city has been called many names: the northern and second capital of Russia, Peter's Paradise, the city of white nights, rain and fog, northern Palmyra, the cultural capital, the city of three revolutions, northern Venice. It's been calculated that St. Petersburg has 35 names. Here is one of them, the city on the Neva. Many tried to build a city on the bogs and swamps at the mouth of this river. However, only Peter the Great succeeded in 1703. The stormy Neva River could not but surrender, so let's take a walk along its banks. We will see St. Pete's palaces, its cathedrals, fortresses, monuments. Besides, we will visit contemporary spaces to find out how the city has changed and what it has become. But first, I'll tell you how to get to St. Petersburg. One way is to travel by plane to Pulkovo Airport. Another option is perfect for sea lovers. As St. Petersburg has access to the Baltic Sea, it has its own port. Of course, you can come to St. Petersburg by car, bus or train. Bus station number 2 on the Obvodny Canal welcomes guests from Finland, and so does the Finlandsky railway station. In the square in front of the station, people can not only meet or see each other off, but also admire the colorful fountains that perform a sort of dance to classical music in summer. Vostania Square is the first thing most guests of St. Petersburg see, at least those who arrive at Moscow railway station, the largest in the city. When Nicholas I decided to connect Moscow and St. Petersburg with the railway, this square became the terminus. Back then, though, it was called Znamenskaya, after the church with which the history of the square began. Nowadays, there is a station of St. Petersburg Metro, which is, by the way, said to be the deepest in the world. We are heading to the main street. Nevsky Prospect is only a few years younger than St. Petersburg itself. It sounds surprising, but at first one had to pay to use the street. And not only with money, people would pay with cobblestones, which were used to improve the roadway. That is how Nevsky became the longest cobble street in Russia. In those days, the nobility preferred to stroll along the sunny side with even numbering, but they ordered to build palaces on the shady side. In the 19th century, a good suntan was viewed as a sign of bad taste. Soon after, though, mansions, shops and theaters began to appear on both sides. Today, Nevsky Prospect is designated as the UNESCO World Heritage Site, along with the historical center of the city. And it shouldn't surprise anyone, because St. Petersburg was built by the best architects from Russia and all over the world. The Eliseevsky store is one of the main gastronomic attractions of St. Petersburg. When it opened its doors in 1902, citizens were amazed and outraged. A store with an Art Nouveau decor was a trend of the new era and was very different from any classical exterior. While some people called the building ugly, it did not prevent the rich from buying French marzipans and fresh oysters here at Eliseevsky. To tell the story of its appearance on Nevsky, we have to go back 2 centuries in time. On Christmas Eve, a Count Sheremetev serf, Pyotr Yeliseev, served his master fresh strawberries, which he had grown in the greenhouse. The Count was so amazed that he not only granted his serf freedom but also startup capital. A year later, Pyotr opened a delicatessen shop. A beautiful story, isn't it? This tale about a commoner making his way into high society was the one that Yeliseyevs launched in St. Petersburg newspapers on the store's centennial anniversary. Such was the marketing ploy, but there is some truth in every tale. Pyotr Yeliseyev would sell expensive wines and colonial products brought from abroad by ship. After his death, the business only grew bigger. His sons delivered wine of their own production to the imperial court. And this place, which reminds us of a modern shopping center with a store on the first floor, a theater on the second, and a restaurant on the third, was opened by Pyotr's grandson Grigory. In memory of the glorious past, there will soon be a museum boasting antiques and pre-revolutionary assortment of goods from all over the world, which could be purchased with chic and style right on Nevsky. Let's move on and see the building that has become the landmark of the city. At the beginning of the 20th century, the famous Zinger Corporation decided to build its head office in St. Petersburg, the first 11-story skyscraper. There was only one problem. It wasn't allowed to build anything higher than the Winter Palace. Architect Pavel Suzor figured out how to stand out from the crowd without breaking any rules. He decorated the building with a dome with a glass globe. The dome as if hinted that Zinger would conquer the world. If you look inside, you will be greeted by the Valkyries at the front door. One of them is holding a spindle, the other the caduceus, a symbol of trade. Well, let's see what they have on offer now. Back in the Soviet era, the Zinger building accommodated the House of Books. It did not stop working even during the siege, when shells and bombs exploded around. Today it is one of the largest bookstores in Europe. Here you can find any book, listen to a favorite poetry writer at literary events, and even have a cup of coffee, which I will go for now. On the second floor of the Zinger store, there is a cozy cafe. It is worth going up here to enjoy the view from the panoramic windows onto the Kazan Cathedral, which looks just as majestic as its Italian prototype, St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. There are more than 200 cathedrals and churches in St. Petersburg, and many of them are famous around the world. Church of the Savior on Spilled Blood. It stands on the spot where the revolutionary mortally wounded Emperor Alexander II. The temple was built in Neo-Russian style. The mosaic inside covers an area of more than 7,000 square meters. Small neat convent and cathedral. Empress Elizabeth spent her childhood here and wished to retire among its walls, but her dream could not come true. The temple construction took almost 90 years. St. Isaac's Cathedral, the main cathedral of St. Petersburg, was rebuilt 4 times. The author of the final project was a French architect, Auguste de Montferrand. To prevent the construction from collapsing on swampy soil, 11,000 piles were used in the foundation. Besides, for the first time in history, columns weighing 64 tons were raised to a height of 40 meters, a true technological miracle. About 400 kilograms of pure gold and more than 40 most valuable minerals were used to decorate the cathedral. When Nicholas I saw the final cost estimate, he was horrified and ordered to save at least on utensils. It was the most expensive temple in Europe, but you must agree, it was worth every penny. St. Petersburg's history began with Peter and Paul Fortress. In 1703, the Great Northern War was still going on. Very soon, though, the Russians managed to liberate the whole Neva area from the Swedes. Here on Zaitchi, Hare Island, Peter ordered the construction of a fortress to protect his lands. It was named in honor of the Apostle Peter, St. Petersburg. Despite the fact that the war continued and the land still legally belonged to Sweden, Peter had everything already decided. He built a city on the banks of the Neva, declared that St. Petersburg was the new capital of the Russian Empire in 1712, and in fact ruled the country from the territory of a foreign state for 9 years. Admiralty. Peter began to build it immediately after the founding of St. Petersburg. Shipyard carpenters worked here from 5 a.m. to 9 p.m. And so did Peter himself as a chief master. He built ships to make the Russian Empire a maritime power. I write, I read without a lamp, and clear are the sleeping deserted streets, and bright is the Admiralty needle. These are the lines by Alexander Pushkin in the poem The Bronze Horseman. That's how the spire on the central tower of the Admiralty was called the Admiralty Needle. Timber was delivered to the Admiralty shipyard from the island of New Holland. Peter the Great invited the Dutch to work at the shipyards on the left bank of the Neva. The atmosphere was so reminiscent of a foreign port that people started to call this area Holland. These days, the former warehouses are replaced by trendy modern spaces. This is a former smithy, where woodworking tools were forged. Now there is a restaurant and a cafe. Offenders were sent here to the sea prison, which was nicknamed the bottle for its unusual round shape. They say that is where the expression "don't get into the bottle," said to someone who inadequately reacts to one's words as if asking for punishment, comes from. Nowadays it houses yoga and ballet classes as well as designer shops. The house where a commandant used to live with his assistants has been turned into space for workshops and educational events for children. As you can imagine, it's never boring here in New Holland. On the islands or any parts of the city, you can find a quiet place for fishing. The most favorite fish of the locals is smelt. It was so loved that in 1708 Peter the Great himself ordered a celebration in its honor. Since then, you can attend a festival that smells of fish and cucumber every spring. St. Petersburg has 42 islands and 300 bridges. And it's not surprising, the city is built on water which is everywhere, in canals and rivers. The stormy Neva, the calm Fontanka, the windy Moika, as if in Venice, they flow through the streets, occupying that part of them which is usually called the carriageway. In warm weather, numerous motor ships and gondolas ply along them, just like in the old days. According to Peter's plans, Vasilyevsky Island was to become Russian Amsterdam, or at least Russian Venice. The architect Domenico Trezzini designed the network of canals. The longitudinal ones were to be called perspectives, and the transverse ones lines. However, those plans were not meant to come true. Over time, the channels got shallow and they had to be filled up. In memory of the planned project, the names of the lines, which for the most part are numbered from 1st to 29th, and wide avenues remain to this day. But this place has something to offer, the so-called Spit of Vasilyevsky Island. Architect Jean-François Thomas de Thomond thought about the project of the site for a long time, when one day his wife brought him morning coffee. He looked at the tray and realized what exactly the spit should look like. Tons of earth were brought to the banks of the Neva, thousands of piles were installed. Eventually, the embankment was moved forward and acquired the shape of a tray for a coffee pot, the first Russian stock exchange, and cups, rostral columns. It's time for us to move on. A beautiful view on Palace Embankment opens up from this spot, and it's not far from the main square of the city. That's where we are going. When Petersburg was not 300 but 30 years old, the view from the palace was different. When looked out of her window, Empress Anna Ioannovna saw a picturesque meadow where she loved to chase hares. Meanwhile, cows were herded here during the reign of Elizabeth. Catherine the Great, however, did not want to see them. It's under her rule that this square was built in front of the palace. Palace Square has always been a place for major events, parades, concerts. Every summer, on a day around the summer solstice, the Palace Square becomes a venue for a unique festival, Scarlet Sails, which celebrates the end of the school year. Scarlet Sails, a story about a girl who believed in a miracle and a miracle happened, is also a message to school graduates embarking on a new journey into adult life. On the shortest summer night, hundreds of thousands of citizens and tourists gather on the bridges and embankments to see a beautiful frigate with scarlet sails sailing along the Neva in the light fireworks. Originally, there were private palaces in a semicircle. After the Napoleon invasion of Russia, they were replaced by the General Staff Building. To honor the victory of Russian arms, the palaces were connected with the Triumphal Arch. It was supposed to glorify the merits of the Emperor Alexander I. Besides, in honor of the emperor who defeated Napoleon, a 50-meter-high Alexander column was installed in the center of the square. It is crowned with the figure of an angel trampling a serpent with the cross. When the emperor saw the column, he said to the architect Montferrand, "You have made yourself immortal," and he was right. There are many places in the city where you can contemplate classical or contemporary art. One of them, you will be surprised, is the oldest Lutheran church of Wannekirche. At the time of Peter the Great, many Dutch and Germans worked in St. Petersburg and they needed a Lutheran church. In 1775, the architect Uri Felten, the author of the interiors of the Winter Palace and its square, created the Anna Kirche. During the Soviet years, serving in the church ceased. Instead, it functioned as a movie theater or a concert venue. A few years ago, the building that stayed abandoned for years was returned to parishioners who continue restoring it. In addition to religious events, contemporary art exhibitions and lectures are held in the church nowadays. All funds are spent on the restoration, and the parishioners grow not only spiritually, but also culturally. Palace Square 2. The address of the main imperial residence. Previously, there were 1,500 rooms here, ceremonial halls, bedrooms, libraries, chapels, a theater. Apparently, Catherine the Great felt those were not enough. So, a small pavilion was built right next to the palace, the Hermitage, which is translated from French as a private space or a hermit's cell. It's pretty impossible to call it this way today, as the Hermitage is visited by 4 million people every year, no privacy. The history of this museum began with small things. The Prussian merchant Johann Ernst Gotskowski owed grain to the Russian army and decided to pay off with paintings. Catherine accepted the offer and placed them in her Hermitage. The Empress liked it so much that she bought whole collections of paintings. When there was no room in the original small Hermitage, they built the big and then the new one. The Egyptian pharaohs were supposed to meet visitors in the new Hermitage, as conceived by the architect Leo von Klenze. But Emperor Nicholas I was indignant. "I'm building the Hermitage, not a tomb." And he told his architects to come up with something Greek. This is how the atlases appeared. Everyone liked them at once. At the Soviet times, there was even a song dedicated to them, which became a kind of hymn for the Hermitage. When your heart is heavy and your chest is cold, come to the steps of the Hermitage at dusk. There, without water or bread, forgotten for centuries, atlases hold the sky in stone hands. Today, the Hermitage boasts more than 3 million exhibits, while the Louvre has only about 300,000. If you want to visit all of its halls, you will have to walk at least 20 kilometers. In the same way, if you devote at least a minute to each exhibit, it will take you 10 years, or maybe more. The next stop on our cultural route is one of the world's best opera and ballet theaters, the Mariinsky Theater. It was named this way in honor of Alexander II's wife, Maria, who was actively involved in charity work and patronized the arts. Imagine, to commemorate this great woman, the artist repeated the pattern of the Empress's coronation dress on the stage curtain. Among the greatest artists who performed in Mariinsky were the choreographer Marius Petipa and composer Pyotr Tchaikovsky, ballet stars Vaslav Nijinsky and Anna Pavlova, as well as soloists Fyodor Shaliapin and Igor Stravinsky. The stage was equipped with the latest technology, and the voices of the opera singers sounded majestically. Only a century later, the secret of such good acoustics revealed itself. During the restoration of the theater, the builders raised the floor of the orchestra pit and found pieces of broken crystal there. Every year, the Mariinsky gives the stage to the best opera singers, ballet dancers, and musicians from all over the world that shine at the White Night Stars Festival, an event not to miss. The imperial family spent winter in the capital, but for the summer they usually moved to the suburbs of St. Petersburg. Here we are. Our first stop is Tsarskoye Selo, now the town of Pushkin. Here we find the Catherine Palace, the residence of the three empresses. The palace took its name after Catherine I, who ordered the laying of a two-story building that would have 16 chambers. The next owner, Elizabeth Petrovna, found it too modest. No wonder she rebuilt it 4 times. 100 kilograms of gold were spent only on decoration. The azure walls in combination with white columns conveyed the elated festive mood of the cheerful Empress Elizabeth. Let's take a walk around the palace. Luxury on the outside and luxury on the inside. Among the many rooms, the most famous is the Amber Room. No wonder it is called the 8th wonder of the world. Its history is amazing. The Prussian King William presented Peter the Great with amber panels. Later, by order of Peter's daughter, Elizabeth, the architect Francesco Rastrelli created a magnificent amber interior. Tragically, during the Second World War, the Germans took out the room and no one else saw it. Its reconstruction took almost 25 years and 6 tons of amber. It looks even better than in Elizabethan time. The third owner of the residence, Catherine the Great, did not allow state funds to be squandered on the palace. When she found out how much it cost to repair the gilded statues, she ordered them to be coated with plain ochre. She reproached her predecessor for wastefulness, called the palace whipped cream, and tried to restore its original modest appearance. In her leisure time, Empress Catherine II loved to go hunting near the palace. When her son Paul and his wife Maria gave birth to their first child, she granted these lands to a young family. This is how the city of Pavlovsk was founded. Later, Catherine sent the architect Charles Cameron here. No one expected such generosity from her, and he designed this classic palace, decorated with a touchy monogram, PM. It is arguably the most comfortable residence in the suburbs of St. Petersburg. Later, Paul gave it to his wife and built a new one to his own taste in Gatchina, which Maria did not like and said, "It's hard to fight with the mistress, especially if it is Gatchina." In fact, the first owner of the Gatchina Palace over the Silver Lake was Count Orlov. Empress Catherine II presented these lands to her favorite for organizing a palace school, thanks to which she received the throne. The Count did not live long in a new palace, reminiscent of a medieval castle. After his death, Catherine granted her gift to her son Paul, who set up his little military estate here. longing for feats and glory. Paul surrounded the castle with a moat and a wide parade ground, where military parades were held. On the lakes, the maneuvers of the Gatchina flotilla with boarding and landings were played out. Paul even created a well-trained army, but Catherine II called it the game of soldiers. Regardless of anything, Paul I was very happy. No matter how good these suburban palaces are, they cannot surpass Peterhof, the residence of Peter the Great. The acclaimed Russian poet Gavril Derzhavin wrote, "He who wants to know what Eden's like, come and see Peter's home at the seaside." So let's come and see. Russian Versailles is the unofficial name of the residence of Peter the Great on the shores of the Gulf of Finland. During his trip to France, the emperor was struck by the Versailles fountains. Therefore, he decided to build a residence northwards, so that there were more fountains and they all worked in unison. Peter the Great was a man of his word indeed. By the way, the fountains still operate without pumps, because of the difference in heights and springs. It's a pity that you will not see the splendor in winter. Splendid fountains' role was not just beauty. This way, Peter wanted to represent the sea power of Russia and glorify its victory in the dispute over access to the Baltic Sea. The central figure of the Great Cascade is Samson rendering the lion's mouth. Have you already guessed who is who? Samson represents Russia and Peter, and the lion is a symbol of Sweden and Charles XII. Peter's favorite palace in Peterhof was not the Grand Palace, but the small palace Montplaisir, which in French means my pleasure. In this elegant one-story building in the Dutch style, he worked, relaxed, and admired the views of the Gulf of Finland on the terrace. Could Peter have imagined what his beloved city would become, how its shores would change centuries later? Today, the northern and southern shores of the bay are connected by the western high-speed diameter. Thanks to it, you can cross the metropolis in just 20 minutes. Although the road is tall, it's worth the money paid. This is the most beautiful highway in St. Petersburg. On both sides, it is framed by semicircular supports that resemble whale ribs. There will be overpasses, tunnels and unique bridges ahead. The one above the Morskoye Canal is two-tiered and the highest in St. Petersburg. If you go to the upper level, you will find yourself at an altitude of almost 70 meters. Further on, there are cable-stayed suspension bridges that seem to be hovering over the city. The view from here is so impressive that you want to make a stop, but it's dangerous. It is a better idea to take part in the annual marathon when the road is blocked and everyone can safely admire the spectacular views of the new business district of St. Petersburg. Gazprom Arena resembles a spaceship. When the weather is good, the roof of the stadium is open. Football matches and hockey games are held here, as well as concerts. In the distance, you can see the new public space, Sevkabil Port. It is located on the territory of the first cable plant in Russia. Recently, some workshops were vacated and art studios, cafes, shops were opened in them, while the walls were painted with graffiti. In the oldest village of Lahta, a glass ship rises high on the shores of the bay. This is a business center, the outlines of which from afar resemble a sailing ship. Its spire or mast pierces the clouds. Lahta Center is the tallest skyscraper in Europe. Why did we come here? Because from its viewpoint you can finally see the whole city of St. Petersburg.